The ego and resistance. So first, what is the ego? Now we have this identity and this idea of the ego being something that just represents this cockiness, this stubbornness, this very out loud side of us that can bother other people or can make us look like we're impervious to damage. But that's only a version and a way that the ego shows up, and that shows up for particular people in that way because it's their coping mechanism. So what the ego really is, and I'll do a whole segment on what the ego is just as itself, but for the sake of today and ego and resistance, the ego is basically this identity within us that sets up all of our coping mechanisms, our programs, our survival programs, our attachments, etc., as a means to survive, based on the wounds that we've had and the conditions that we've been exposed to in our childhood, our environment, etc. So it's an identity that lives within us, and it keeps following us and it keeps evolving based on recognizing each scenario that we're getting into. Now, here's what's interesting is that the ego's idea of us, having a life is all about just survival. So the ego is not necessarily looking out for our best interests, it's looking out just for survival interests. But for the relevance of today's talk that we're talking about for this video, we're going to be talking about the ego and resistance. So the ego's job, very much so when it comes to you working through inner work or you evolving in your life, is to resist change. Because the ego hates change. It hates to be challenged, as we've recognized with like our ego showing up in different ways. It hates to be invalidated and it hates to be disconfirmed, because by doing that the ego starts to feel like its use in your life is kind of minimal. So think about like the ego identity. The more we fuel it by our coping programs, the more, for example, if we go along wounded programs, the more we attract the same type of dysfunctional relationships, etc. The ego feels like, yeah, I get to like step into this. The more you get triggered, it's like, yeah, I get to bring out like this animated survival program. I either get to go into my fight program, my flight program, I get to go into my freeze program, whatever it is, but I get to be used. So it gets very excited the more that it has an exposure to wounding or to triggering or to challenge, to your inner child or your wounds being challenged, because then the ego steps into play. But the more awareness you create for yourself, the more you start to recognize where your wounds are coming from, the more you start to now even provide more healing. The ego starts to recognize for itself, whoa, 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 now this person, this this identity of the me, is starting to feel more secure, which means that they feel like they need me less to step into these different survival programs. And so at that point, the ego starts to feel like, I'm going to be needed less, I need to step away. So what it tries to do is it tries to resist. So whenever, very often, when you're trying to create change in your life and you're trying to do a lot of inner work, you're trying to do even meditations, to reading books, to practicing new ways of like awareness, sometimes the first thing you will witness for yourself is resistance. And this resistance will start showing up as your mind overthinking. It'll start showing up as the conscious level of our awareness starting to say to us, I don't know if this is a good idea. I don't know if stepping into this place is going to be helpful. Like, think about like what could happen. Think about that this will leave you in this spot, etc., etc. So especially if we're talking about relationships, a lot of the time, not for everyone, for a certain group of us, it can look like the ego can look like stepping in to take away vulnerability. It can look like stepping into this place to be able to take away our challenge of being vulnerable, of stepping into a place where we can now trust someone else, of taking the chance, of taking the risk. And so in that space, that's where you experience resistance to saying, no, I don't think you should do it. Like, what if you get hurt? What if you start feeling that pain all over again? And so the ego is like, I'll step in to protect you from going down that way. And so instead, we start to invalidate vulnerability. We start to say, no, this relationship's not worth it. We start to have one foot out the door and one foot inside. And this is something, especially with avoidance, is something that we experience. Now, on the other end, for example, talking about with the anxious, we use vulnerability as a method for our ego to show up. So we get over vulnerable, or we overshare, or we step into trying to overconnect because of our fear, again, that if we're not doing it to that extent, that someone will either leave us or they'll reject us. So we must go all the way out there to that point. So that can look like, I think I've talked about in a previous video, That can look like us jumping into physical connection way too soon, giving ourselves up and the value of our bodies way too soon, just as a means to establish connection. But especially in discussions with your partners, with friends, the relationships are your best way to be able to evaluate who you are, is the best way to be able to mirror back to you what you're going through. Because it is only from the state of where we are that we can potentially attract something else into our life. So it's only from where we really are and what we're experiencing, what our real beliefs are, that we'll pull someone or something in. So for example, if I have a wounded sense of self-belief, I'm going to attract a relationship into my life that will keep challenging that will hurt me and possibly even further suppress my sense of belief, because it's meant to be a way that I can grow and evolve. So until I've actually looked at that wound and I've done that healing, I'm going to keep attracting that pattern. So the ego in this case, in this aspect, especially with relationships, right? So let's say I'm attracting a dysfunctional relationship, or I'm attracting a relationship which is not necessarily good for me, but it's coming into my life based on my sense of self-worth that I'm in, based on the core wound that I haven't healed, and therefore bring out more of my attachment style. If I have a particular survival program, so let's say in this case I'm on the anxious end, and my survival program is more about fighting or fawning, doing one of those two things so that I can attempt to get more connection from someone by fighting with them or by pleasing them all the time, then that's how my ego will step in every time there's a confrontation or every time that there's a challenge. So your ego will step in primarily when your sense of security is being challenged. So when you start to feel like you're threatened in any way, your ego will step in with a particular program. So in that case, as me being an anxious and stepping to fight, it'll look like me arguing with my partner. It'll look like me trying to impress my idea constantly onto them. And the reason that I'm doing it is not necessarily because I want my voice to be heard. And this is what's really important. It's because I want to feel like I can be right. It's because I want to feel in that moment that only what I believe or what I feel or what I'm going through is what's relevant in that moment. And what also happens at that time is I stop listening really to what my partner is saying to me. I may hear what they're saying, so I can use their words and I can possibly even twist them around, and then I can give them back to them in terms of argument. But I'm not really listening to what's behind it. I'm not really listening to what's behind their pain. I'm not really necessarily listening to what's behind their emotions. And the reason I'm not doing it is because if you tie it back to vulnerability, right? It's because if I were to really listen to what they were saying, then that means that I have to give up my position in this hardened ego position of saying like, I want to be right, I want to be proved right in terms of the fight scenario, which then leads to me believing from my wounded identity that there possibly may not be conflict. And if there isn't conflict, then there's a possibility that we may not even establish connection, that my partner may not even be paying that much attention to me, that my partner may not recognize me. And so I want to keep stepping into this place of like the fight from this particular pattern, so that I can establish a way of attempting a wounded connection. The wounded aspect is so subconscious, we don't really realize we're doing it. But what ends up happening is that ultimately it's this series of conflict, and as we grow in our relationships, the conflict, unless healed, can become worse and worse and more serious. It ultimately leads to the demise of the relationship. It ultimately leads to the relationship not working out, which then, tying back into our self-worth, makes us feel like, oh my God, I don't deserve love. I don't know if I'll get it. I don't know if I'll get connection again, which then again leads to the ego stepping up into its position of like worth, of getting ready to say, that's it. I'm going to now protect you again and try and like retry these same patterns over and over and over again. So resistance, again, coming back to the topic of this video, is one of the biggest ways that the ego shows up, because anything that, there's a really famous saying that within the discomfort lies the growth. Oftentimes in a place that we don't really want to venture to lies the growth. But as human beings, and especially like I said with the ego hates change. So it doesn't want you to step into that discomfort. It tries to mask to you that where you are is comfortable. Just stay with the same pattern of this fight, this flight, this this fawning. Just stay here. Don't really change it. Don't challenge the status quo, because then we can continue to have the same patterns. Okay, we won't have successful relationships. Whatever, at least we'll continue with the same patterns, and so we won't get challenged. And so the ego resists every time you're trying to do inner work, or if you're trying and attempting to connect with a partner and saying, you know what, I want to try this vulnerability thing. The ego will do all it can in that moment to make you have second thoughts, to make you have doubts, and then to think, all kinds of different things about your partner. So it may not even just be about that moment of conflict. You may now start to think, is this really the partner that I want? Are they even really that attractive? Will this thing work out? Let's say it could be any factors working against you, like it could be distance. And then it would be like, oh, will it work because of the distance? It could be maybe there's a language barrier, a cultural barrier. And those things will start to show up so much more, like obviously, so much more evidently, because that is your ego trying to step into a way of trying to challenge you and trying to again make you say, yeah, you know what, you're right, I should give this up. So whenever you're recognizing resistance in your life about anything, right, about stepping into a particular type of relationship, about making a decision for yourself, about even drawing a boundary, what I try to tell my students and what I try to tell them as a way to disarm the ego, so to be able to pull down the ego and recognize that, okay, this is more my ego acting up than it really is me, is to sit with yourself, meditate for like a minute or two. So just do a little breath work. You can just sit and, introspect with yourself a little bit and ask yourself, what do I really want? What would really benefit me as a human being, as a person, as someone who's loved, who's cared for, as someone who's important? What would really benefit me in this moment? What's important for me in this moment? Will this challenge? Will this vulnerability? Will this method of inner work challenge or awareness, will it help me evolve? Okay, so in this moment, if that's important for me, then I want to recognize that I'm going to commit to doing that. I'm going to put both my feet in, and I'm going to trust. And I'm going to trust that even if it doesn't work out, that I will be able to stand on my own 2 feet. I'll be able to hold ground for myself. I'll be able to feel safe and secure and take care of myself and heal and learn the lessons. So I trust, and I'm going to go into this. And I'm going to trust that this thing is what's important for my growth. Then what you do in that moment is you're now feeling secure about your decision. You're now feeling secure about your choice. You're now feeling more grounded about you taking that step. And you'll notice automatically, bit by bit, that your ego will start to come down. Your ego will start to like slowly allow itself to let go. And so in various other scenarios, like for example, when we talk about people who are being like cocky or like overconfident, etc., those are all masks. Those are all masks that they wear to protect an insecurity that's inside. Because if you were truly that secure, you wouldn't need to like stand and like beat the drum so everybody's aware about it and you can tell them. You'd know, and your security would be so strong from within. So one of the biggest ways to actually disarm the ego, as I said in this moment, is to ask yourself in those moments, what would really benefit me? I haven't talked about the inner child much on this video, but the way I actually tell my students to do it is to say, what would my inner child really want in this moment? What would be really important for my inner child to feel in this moment? Would it be beneficial for them for me to take this decision? Would it be important for them for me to challenge myself and change these patterns? Okay, then I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it with love. And then you notice your ego starts to step down in those moments. And in those moments, you start to feel more vulnerability, more safety, more truth. And the long-term way of disarming your ego on a longer basis is just constantly by focusing on more internal security, building more love, building more safety, building more value of the self. There's various ways to do that. I'm not going to explain all of that on this. But by doing that, you start to notice that the need for those coping mechanisms, the need for those survival programs, the need to resist change starts to drop because you're not afraid of change. Change could mean something more so magical for you. It could mean an opportunity for you to evolve. It could mean an opportunity for you to invite better relationships, more successful connection, more growth for yourselves, more love, more physical connection. All of it could come from it, more awareness. And so at that point, as you feel more of that truth and you connect with it and you start trusting that, you start to let the ego drop down bit by bit and you start to discover more of who you really are, and the resistance starts to slowly fade away. But it can only happen with practice. It can only happen with continually in those moments of resistance, asking yourself, instead of making it like a decision out of like that frustration and that resistance, be like, no, I don't want to do it, and then feeling like uncomfortable with this back and forth, just sit with yourself for a minute. And then make that decision for your true self, your inner child, for your own loving self. And you'll see the ego slowly die down.